Hello and welcome to Choose a Fi. Today on the show, we have our good friend Brian Eufinger back. He was last here in episode 154 and before that in episode 114. And he is truly a college expert on all things college, hacking the FAFSA, demystifying college scholarships, talking through PSAT, National Merit Scholarship. These are all the things that he's talked about previously. But ultimately, his message is preparation and knowledge. What can you do years ahead of time to prepare? What do you need to know about merit aid, about the FAFSA, about the CSS profile? There are all of these things that a lot of us with children can do to prepare. And I know personally, this is top of mind because my older daughter is a 10th grader now. And I actually just attended one of Brian's info sessions and it blew my mind. It was remarkable how much information he had. And I knew I had to get him back on. So this is really one you don't want to miss. Welcome to Choose Up Fi. Brian, my friend, thank you so much for coming back on. I really appreciate it. It's great to see you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, it should be fun. So I did not mention at the top, and we'll certainly talk about this, but you are the co-founder of Edison Prep, which ultimately I think provides SAT and ACT tutoring. You're in the Atlanta, Georgia area, but now post-COVID era, you're also doing it online as well. So I know
Correct.
my daughter is going to take advantage of that certainly. And yeah, like I said, this information session that I attended was mind-blowing. And I think on some level, I'd like to recreate as much of that as we can, but really giving people an overview of how do you prepare? What do you have to start thinking about? And when do you have to start thinking about it? Why don't we start there?
Sure. So basically, one of my passions is just generally speaking, it doesn't matter where and how you do it, is just cutting the cost of college has always been my passion out of self-interest when I was in high school because I grew up with not the most money in the world. And college, my alma mater, is officially 258% as expensive now as when I attended. So there were a lot of reasons to get educated on this stuff when I was applying. There's even more now. And the biggest thing is, it's like that old saying that the best time to plant a tree was 10 years ago. The second best time is today. Ideally, I wish I could talk to a lot of eighth grade parents. So at least, even though FAFSA does not go back, 4 years, you're fine. But the earlier you can get educated and know the guardrails and how the parameters are, you can make sure you don't make what could ultimately be, some 5 and 6 figure mistakes, especially if you have 2, 3, or more kids. The analogy I always use at a lot of our parent meetings is that early college information is like yeast. It just makes the dough rise. So that's the goal with all the talks I do, whether it be merit aid, FAFSA, SAT, ACT, all of it.
Okay. So 8th grade would be the ideal, but the info session that I attended was for, I guess, sophomore parents.
It's very hard to convince eighth grade parents to do that. But, and just the short version is, the reason why the eighth grade period is specifically mentioned is you can make some big GPA mistakes freshman year that fundamentally alter and eliminate certain options from the game. So FAFSA stuff does not look back that far, but GPA, the very first day of freshman year, things get real. And so, trying really hard from the first day of high school is important to not foreclose options and to get as low of a cost at as good of a school as you can.
Yeah, that's a brilliant point. And it's funny. That's very personal with my own high school story, which is obviously a couple decades ago. So I feel that very, very viscerally. That's for darn sure. Okay. So right. GPA is important through any courses that would reflect on your GPA on your high school transcript, essentially. And some of those could start as early as 8th grade, potentially.
Well, you want to make sure you register for good classes in 9th grade. Technically, 9th grade is when when things begin.
Okay. So, all right, how should we start thinking about this? So, like you said, your passion is cutting the cost of college, but that's a very large thing to undertake.
Sure.
I guess what's the first step? So, right, we want to reach people, ideally 8th grade, potentially 9th grade, 10th grade parents. Where do you start them out?
So there's two ways to look at it. So obviously one of the big topics, we're recording this here on October 13th, 2023, and things are changing. There has been some delays in the release of the new FAFSA, which we'll talk about in a minute. So I guess there's really two chunks that you can think about in this episode. There's the more FAFSA and governmental forms. There's FAFSA and there's the CSS profile, which are the two main financial aid forms that people fill out. We can talk about those. And let's say that you've maximized and optimized everything you're capable of doing based on your situation. Then there's additional things we can mention that can further help address the cost of college, things involving merit aid, grades, other things.
Okay, I like that. So, right, the merit aid was the biggest eye opener for me. I did not realize that in many colleges, it seems like there are formulas of if you have X SAT or ACT grade and Y GPA, then you might qualify for this amount. And if you get over a certain threshold, there are other things. Is that generally how people should think about merit aid, like from a very high level? Like, where do we start with merit aid?
Yeah, I mean, we are in a golden era of merit aid. I'll admit, I do not like the idea that a lot of kids are applying to 20 colleges, and I'm
Yeah.
also a hypocrite because I knew that we were broke and needed to find a way to pay for college. I knew that I would get into most of the colleges I applied to, but I'd heard from my older friends how wildly different and unpredictable the merit aid that they received was. That was then. That was, almost 20 years ago. Now, to their credit, a lot of colleges are very transparent, either out of generosity or to avoid phone calls from parents. But whether it be Auburn has a merit aid grid, Michigan State does. Just a lot more so public than private, but hundreds of schools publish these grids that are very transparent. Where along the up and down axis they will have GPA, and along the top they will have your test scores. And it's very comforting for parents who are trying to plan and budget to not have to apply to a million schools just to play footsies and see what might they give me. They're very transparent. I applaud them for doing way better than when you and I were applying to college.
Yeah, I mean that to my recollection that did not exist. I can't ever think of seeing a grid of that sort. But yeah, I know I just went to my wife Laura and I went to a college up in Fredericksburg, Virginia, just to walk around the campus, frankly. But we went to the admissions office, and yeah, that was the very first thing they handed us was this grid. So it seems that is much more common now, which is interesting. So right, GPA and test scores, right? Those are the two big metrics. But now you're saying, is that mostly for public schools? Did I hear you say that?
I mean, there are private schools who I would say, maybe sometimes don't post the grids as publicly. Public schools are more likely to just have a grid, like a big diagram, tic-tac-toe box that shows you what you get for what set of scores, which is going back to what you said before, why starting the first day of ninth grade, things matter because, your GPA is one of those two columns. And it can range from, ones that have a bunch of different gradients to one like, say, Auburn, where Auburn has the same GPA, 3.5, for all three levels of their out-of-state merit aid grid. So basically that because most people who apply to Auburn and get in are going to have a 3.5 anyways, it's almost like that GPA is just sort of there as a beginning assumption.
Right.
And then
It's table stakes, more or less.
yeah. So the entire merit aid grid essentially is just based on that test score. And this is something that I know, I'm an avid Choosify listener, and people that listen to your podcast would appreciate this story. There's a guy who works in my office complex. We tutored his son this year, and his son had an awesome job at Firehouse Subs, making $9.50 an hour or whatever it was. And his dad is not from this country originally, and he thinks that we spend a lot of time in extracurriculars and stuff. And in his country, it's more about academics and learning and stuff. And so he also cannot afford full price out of state to some of the schools his son wanted to look at, including, as it happens to be, Auburn. And so Auburn, to their credit, has this transparent aid grid, and the dad is a CPA by trade. And so he likes numbers. He knows his way around a spreadsheet. And he came over to my office unannounced one day, and he just took the back page of his son's ACT exam. And his son, because irony is fun, his son was one question below what the score would take to get the very bottom level of the Auburn merit aid grid. And truthfully, just based on the parameters, in order for his son to be able to afford Auburn, he would need to get to the top rung. There's 3 rungs. And so he's like, correct me if I'm wrong. He's like, do I need to just fix about 26 questions? And I go, like, literally, the difference between 26 questions out of the 215 separates getting Willy Wonka nothing from getting literally $70,000+ of merit aid. He's like, so you telling me each one of these questions is more than a mortgage, like a mortgage payment or two? I'm like, that's 100% what I'm saying. And so, not in a mean way, but it made no mathematical sense. He promptly left his job at Firehouse Subs, and his dad said, you can come to my office and surrender your cell phone to me, because we know teenagers, and I will pay you the same $9.50 an hour that Firehouse Subs is paying you, no limit, because it was just a targeted expected value bet, like it's a poker bet. I bet if I pay him $500, he might not get the highest level, but he'll at least get something. Either way, he will get the biggest ROI possible. And yeah, dad ended up paying him $500 or $600 of his former Firehouse wages. And he pounded out a ton of tests this summer, and he used the rounding. He did get a 32.5, but that technically does round to 33. So he got his score, and good for him. Because, I mean, if you do the backwards math, his dad paid him a couple $100, divide by $9.50 an hour. It was, less than one football season would have taken for him to play one sport at school. So
Yeah.
not a 2-hour miracle, but and the funny part is the son thinks that he won. And like, we don't need to tell him he didn't. Like, dad is the one who won here. Like, son thinks he won. Like, but yeah, everybody wins. But but I love the transparency, because truly it was annoying that I had to apply to a ton of colleges back in 1999 just to see which, because I applied to similar air quotes schools, and I got wildly different merit aid grids based on no seeming rhyme or reason. So I do like that things have evolved in what I think is a more generous and fair, transparent way.
Yeah, agreed. It was definitely the wild, wild west back when you and I applied. I think I was 97. So, yeah,
Hmm.
similar thing. And right. It just seemed very arbitrary. That's the word that I always use to describe it. Both the admissions and the merit aid, it just was all over the place. So, I love that there's this analytical way to look at it now. And
Yeah,
this father, I mean, that's the best story I've ever heard, right? He
yeah.
essentially said, hey, 26 questions. This is going to be worth $3,000 a question to me, more or less.
And the kid, to his credit, he did the work. He is a little bit of like a bro, where he probably plays a lot of Xbox, but he hated the fact that you could tell he was smart enough to understand. Yeah, I probably should do this, because that's a lot of money, and that's just not that many questions. Like, he hated that he understood the logic, because he knew that he would be silly to not do so. Now, first of all, we're talking about FAFSA and CSS profile today. I would highly encourage anybody to go back and listen to episode 114. 95% of that info is still just as good as it was a few years ago when we recorded it. But don't take that one example from Auburn and think that the only thing that matters is test scores. I get parents all the time that call me and say, my sixth grader wants to prep for the SAT. And it's like, call me later. The only thing that matters the first 2 years of high school is getting involved in activities, taking hard classes, and getting the best GPA you possibly can, just because GPA is and should be the most important factor. And sometimes people want to put the cart before the horse and start doing SAT prep way, way too early.
Yeah, and I was very impressed. Obviously, you run a test prep company, but you strongly advise people don't even start thinking about this until at the earliest second semester sophomore year
Sure.
was the advice that I heard.
Because kids are busy with summer camp, with sports, whatever. Yes, if I were a high school principal and I was in charge, I would love to make every sophomore, the last 2 days of sophomore year, take a full length SAT, then take a full length ACT. Not because you're going to start studying the next day, but just because then, before you scatter to summer camp and everything else, if you can at least be making a plan and understand, I'm better at this test, and oh wow, am I on the 5 yard line and I need barely any improvement, I can be done, or oh wow, I am so far away. Just knowing good news, bad news, just where you stand, it de-stresses the household so much when you just have a sense of where you stand.
Yeah, and certainly getting the reps in is so important. So is there a way to take a full length exam that's like under pseudo test conditions that are not like actually signing up for the exam?
Sure. So, I mean, what happens is they are debuting a digital SAT, first time ever, where the paper SAT ceases to exist on December 2nd of 2023. And then after a 100-day hiatus, they're rebooting it as the digital SAT. It'll be fully administered on a computer, just like your daughter's PSAT was yesterday. So yesterday's PSAT was the coming out party for the digital SAT. And
Ah.
so it's a shorter format. It's also adaptive for the SAT. The ACT, to be clear, is staying paper. It's the same format it's been since, basically the 60s. So it's very familiar. But the digital one is going to be on a computer, and it's going to be adaptive. So based on how you do in the first half of the questions, it will give you easier or harder ones. It's how they can get to a accurate answer a little more quickly by being on a computer and adapting that way. But they're both, Visa, MasterCard, they're both accepted by all schools, which is why, many kids, they are pretty similar on the two tests. But taking a mock of both when kids are busy during junior year, it's great if you can not waste time on your weaker tests, because they both have the same ingredients: math, reading, grammar, etc. But the style and the rigor and the way that the timing is very different. And so it's better to just measure twice, cut once, and pursue the stronger horse. Or as I always say on podcasts, it's better to be varsity in one sport than JV in two, because colleges are just, even if you did submit both, colleges are just going to use the one that's better anyways, makes them look better in the rankings and whatnot.
Interesting. So if you submit it, you have to assume they're looking at everything in terms of does this student get accepted or not accepted? But I guess for reported results, would they only pick the top one?
Yeah, I mean, humans do read the application, so there's no reason to send anything against your own interest. But yeah, if someone has a top 1% ACT and a top 25% SAT, like they shouldn't send, I mean, both of them are classy, but obviously just send your best one. Now, as for your question about mocks, one cool thing, if you type in SAT Blue Book on Google, the College Board has paid for Google Ads, so it's the first link right there. There are 4 real full-length tests of the digital SAT, which a student can easily, for free, in 2 hours, take a real mock SAT and see what their score would look like. Of course, many people that's not even needed because, like your daughter, like the PSAT is very close to the length of it's barely shorter than the real SAT. So that is good enough of a proxy to make the SAT versus ACT decision. So being respectful of students' time, most of the kids we work with that we will use their PSAT score and then say around Valentine's Day they end up taking a mock ACT. Like I can compare those two numbers and that's good enough to make a good decision. As for the mock ACT, anyone can download those online. We offer free mock tests every weekend. Obviously most listeners are not in Atlanta. We offer them in person in Atlanta, but as well as virtual. We do them every weekend. And so just as a public service, kids get a neat little report that says, here's your strengths and weaknesses. You're good at geometry and bad at trigonometry and all that stuff.
Oh, that's very cool. So, right, on edisonprep.com, they can find those every weekend, a free mock test. That's really cool.
edisonprep.com/mocks, MOCKS, and it's already posted through next July. It's always up to date, but I can give you that link for the show notes too.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's great. So, right. And then the piece of advice that was built in there was both of these tests are accepted by virtually every college, and you should pursue your stronger one. So that's why taking the mock tests early, so sometime in sophomore year, is your ideal goal because, like you said, you only need to be varsity in one. So there's no reason. So just from like a very high level, though. So let's say people don't have an expert like you that they can email or call up. Is it as simple as looking at the overall percentile? Like, how would someone at a glance who maybe they know literally nothing about SAT, ACT, is it just percentile? Like, what are they looking for to compare?
So percentiles are not as useful as people think they are. The score is what matters. So when you look at the merit aid grids, any college website, they never list percentiles. They just list, here's the score. And that's pretty transparent on that front.
Okay. And then, so right, again, for someone who knows nothing about the scores, is the easiest way to simply just look at some of these grids from the colleges? Like, again, if they knew nothing about these scores, okay, is a 33 equal to a 1400 on the SAT, or is it equal to a 1470? Like, they would just look at the threshold for particular colleges.
Sure. So I'll give you a couple examples. So most merit aid grids, the vast preponderance of merit aid grids are the 2-factor model of test scores and GPA. And then a couple, actually, like Oklahoma State, one of the two, don't quote me. Arkansas has one too, where like even without the test scores, there's just a 1-bar thing where if, depending what state you live in state, out of state, et cetera, you can get like 30 to 70% off starting at a pretty low GPA, to be honest. And so obviously, Harvard does not need to have a merit aid grid. They do not have a merit aid grid. But depending on the level of competitiveness, if you slide down slightly on the competitiveness level, you'll see, not surprisingly, a little bit more generous of merit aid oftentimes. And people wonder why they do this. Colleges are very much a business. They're nonprofits, but they got to keep the lights on. If someone got the top merit aid grid at one of these large public flagships from out of state, are they still probably generating twice the revenue for the university as an in-state kid does? So, I mean, they're giving a nice discount. It's a great way to get you into the door, and they're still making more off that than in-states. But the discount certainly does not hurt. And a lot of them actually, rather than say, we're giving you this amount of money, it is, if you do this, then you qualify to be treated as an in-state tuition person. So that's a nice one as well.
That's really interesting. So you said in there, slide down the competitiveness scale, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
My larger question is, you obviously know the college landscape better than just about anybody. I feel like there's so much that's overblown about how difficult it is to get into college and how just extraordinarily stressful this is for everyone. But when I've looked at the stats, and now granted, Brian, this has been a long time ago, so I could be woefully out of date. It seems like the top 50 or 100 colleges are extraordinarily difficult to get into. And then the acceptance rates are pretty high thereafter. Like, is it truly difficult to get into college, or is it truly difficult to get into an absolute elite college?
I mean, it depends on the definition of elite. I would say that the increasing competitiveness actually slides further down, certainly than the top 50. I mean, there's thousands of colleges in America, and the majority of them do take the majority of applicants. The question also becomes then at what price? Because there's some schools where it's butts in seats, not to be
Yeah.
crass, but it's they really want to make that money. And there are some places where your FICO score is way more important than your test scores because they have a financial need to fill the seats. But let's use University of Cincinnati as an example. They're a fine school. They're not a top 50 school, but they just bought a hotel. Like you're hearing these stories throughout the whole nation of housing woes where even though you just applied to XYZ University, go ahead before you even find out if you got in or not, go put a non-refundable housing deposit of 100 or 200 bucks because you know what? If you don't, like by the time you find out whether you get in, you might be living 4 miles off campus. But yeah, Cincinnati just bought a hotel, like a 5-year lease.
That's
So
unreal.
it is very much a winners and losers kind of thing. There are some schools, many of them are smaller liberal arts colleges that are second or third tier that have gone out of business, sadly, over the past few years. But many colleges are experiencing we need to rent hotels and force people to put 3 people in a 2-person room and all kinds of shenanigans. So, colleges aren't dying as fast as the media might make them sound. But that's one issue. The other issue is it still comes back to, but at what price? Because there's so many schools where they can be literally 10 times more expensive to attend than another school with the same set of stats, but you walk out with your nursing degree and still can pass your NCLEX and have largely the same job. So it just depends on the exact student and situation in the major.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I'd ask you almost to take your professional hat off for a minute and just, I'd love your subjective advice to this basically. Is like, how do you think about the level of school? Because again, I have a 10th grade daughter. She does really well in grades and she's going to do really well on her tests. But whereas when I was a kid, I was focused on getting into Ivy League schools and the best, whatever. But I always ask the question, like, what are you optimizing for? And like, I'm not that I'm living her life by any means, but like, I'm not optimizing for her to get into Harvard or MIT. I'm optimizing for her to have a wonderful life.
Mm-hmm.
But there's still some balance here of, okay, what does that actually mean? What do we think about in terms of college? Like, are we hamstringing her by totally excluding the elite colleges? Like, again, this is a very circuitous question, Brian, because it's not
Sure.
really a question. It's just like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, how do you think about the landscape?
So there's 3 things I can say about that. So one is my own daughter. We had a wild last 5 years since you and I first met, 6, 7 years ago. We had twins, identical twins, right before COVID. And so because we tutor kids from most of the high schools, public and private, in all of Atlanta, of course, moms are nosy and say, so where are you going to send your students? And so we look at public and private. My personal philosophy is that mental health and happiness should matter a lot, and so it does a student no service. And I'm using K through 12 as an example here, but for college, it does you a disservice to go to a school where you're going to get your butt kicked and feel inadequate, being the lowest person in the totem pole and just overwhelmed at a certain school you can't quite handle is not as great, especially when it might have a higher price tag to boot than a place where you would be a bigger fish and have an easier time and also possibly get some merit aid and a different price. So that's one thing to think about. You have to be honest about your kid and know where they can thrive. I'll give you an example. So standardized tests love me. They always have. I'm a nerd. My wife and we are old, but College Board will still take your credit card happily. We still take the test each year. I've gotten 436s on the ACT and a 1 on the SAT. But still, if I had gone to MIT, would I feel like the dumbest person on earth? It's the smartest school on the planet. Like I'm a pretty smart guy, and I would have not enjoyed it. I would have stayed in my room on Friday night panicking and trying to understand this really hard stuff. And so I think it's important for students without judgment to just be honest. Like this is 4 years of my life. Yes, it's setting me up for my career, but if it's going to be miserable, like you have to know. And also, this is not related to competitiveness. The number of students who I'm just randomly making small talk with when I'm doing a tutoring session, who's like, "Oh, well, I want to do nursing." And then I'm like, you realize that school you just mentioned doesn't even have nursing. Wait, what? Like parents need to put it on students' shoulders to actually reduce some of the research. With Google, it's so fast to see which schools have great programs for XYZ major, or some kids love to have co-ops where you get work experience like built in during your 4 years and stuff. So that's what I would say. Now, to be fair, some of the elite schools, there is a networking component to it, and there's also an internship component to it. So there's a large Fortune 50 company here in Atlanta that I'll leave nameless where we tutor a number of their execs kids. And more from a logistics standpoint and an HR standpoint, they just have a policy. Like, here are the 7 schools we interview from for our interns. And pretty much most of our people in this department come from our internship pool. that we have each summer. So if your student is forward thinking enough that they have an idea of XYZ industry or certain places they want to target, finding out, that's one thing that honestly, when people do backwards walking dorm tours and college tours, I feel like not enough parents ask hard questions about what types of companies do internship interviews here. Like that's one of the most important and under asked questions, because that feeder is so real, and the strength of the relationships that those internships breed. It's not like everyone's gonna go work at the place to do an internship, but there are a lot of first jobs where people, it's just a pipeline built that way. And obviously a lot of the schools that are higher ranked do have better access to some of those employers that are more in demand.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Right. So if you have your heart set on Goldman Sachs or McKinsey, then maybe Penn or Harvard or Stanford might be the worth it in that case. But short of that, because I don't think most people are aspiring to that, or that's realistic. Yeah, know thyself. So the thing that I'm hearing most from you throughout the first 20 minutes here is, okay, there's the intersection of the school, but the price as well. And that's what's so interesting about this new landscape is there is so much transparency that we can have a sense of, okay, what are you going to get in terms of merit aid? And it is very clear as day on these grids. And I absolutely love that. And I think, again, going back to that story of, what was it, Firehouse Subs? Or
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's amazing. You can look at that and say, okay, these tests, I mean, I guess let's go to the test now, Brian, because obviously this is your bread and butter. A lot of people think that these are intelligence tests and that you take it once, you see what you get. And hey, I've been going to school for, at this point, 12 years. What I get is what I get. And it's pretty difficult to improve. But I don't suspect that's your opinion. And I'd love to hear, like, how realistic is it for someone to improve 5, 10, 20% on this? And would it be essentially worth their while?
Yeah, I mean, so we tell people all the time that, ironically, if parents want to convince their student who's smart but maybe a little bit chill and lazy that they can do it, you go on some various Reddit and Discord threads where there are all these kids that are self-studying for the SAT and ACT, and one, it'll convince your student who might be wanting to not practice that there are actually people out there that are pretty hardcore that are chasing some of these top scholarships or top schools. There's that famous Goodwill Hunting scene where I learned a lot for $1.50 in library fines, et cetera. There are so many there are nerdy kids in some Brighton Beach basement in New York that had never had a tutor. They just maybe quietly dad printed off a ton of tests at work on the big copier, and they just wailed away at it. Where I mean, they might have been hellishly inefficient in doing so. That was me. In high school, I didn't have a tutor. I knew I needed money, or my dad said you can just go to local U down the street, and that's fine. So I didn't want that. I just got a bunch of books, and I was super inefficient at it, but I quit JV tennis. I tell kids the first day of our test prep classes, I quit JV tennis. Notice that letter J right in there. I mean, the coach was not too broken up about it. I was not the best player. I enjoyed it. It was fun, but I had 5 APs, and I had band, and I had tennis. Something had to give junior year. And so I got 200 hours of my life back by not doing tennis that year. And I could lie to you and tell you and be a martyr and say I spent painfully 200 hours studying for this test. I spent probably a third of it doing SAT, ACT studying and practice tests. And the other 2/3, I just spent enjoying junior year with my friends, which is also not a bad thing either. And in doing so, paid for both my wife and I met in college and paid for all of room, board, tuition, all of this stuff via these tests. So I approach this entire place from a place of gratitude, because I will never today or ever make more money than I did studying for these tests in high school. It's boring. It's commas, it's rectangles, it's putting in the reps. It is not the Harry Potter sorting hat that it is often branded in the media. And honestly, if it were an IQ test, then no one would ever be able to improve their score, and we'd be out of business because we'd have a bunch of unhappy clients because their scores didn't move. So it's not a 2-hour miracle, but it's important that parents who might be stressed at hearing older parents at their high school share sometimes embellished stories. It is not nearly as scary. If you did every released ACT test that exists on Earth, it would literally take under 200 hours, and no one should ever do that. Like, the average person who does a pretty darn good job is spending 1/4 of what one sports season might take, maybe. So it's not a 2-hour miracle, but it's reasonable. Especially some kids surprise their parents. They take a mock test and they're like, wow, here's the merit aid grid for XYZ school. I'm literally 2 points away. Hey, mom, you mean I can fix 10 questions and just be done? Like, sometimes people are better off than they think.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So, right, a lot of people get up in arms about, oh, we're over testing our kids. I hear a lot of parents talking about opting out of this and that, both of SAT, ACT, but just regular testing. And I mean, listen, I can understand that from a point of view, but realistically, with this case, this is a financial independence show, and this is just brass tacks, right? Like, there are these grids, there are these tests, and you can study and improve your score and get if that example that you showed is representative, $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 per answer that you get correct over your original test. I mean, like, there's remarkable potential here. And that's what I think is so cool about it. Just from, like, again, that ROI, financial independence point of view, just putting aside how you wish the world is, because it's largely relevant. Like, we look at the landscape as it is and we try to maximize and we try to understand that. So I think that is beautiful. I guess just last thing on this, Brian, before we kind of mosey on over to the governmental forms, because I think that there's a
Sure.
lot of detail on that. But in terms of like the courses and studying, like, is a lot of it just familiarizing with the exam itself? Or is it, okay, in the first ACT and SAT test that this student took, we determined they're a little deficient in geometry. So we're going to give them a couple of courses on geometry. Like, how does this, from a very high level, like, how does your course work?
Yeah, I mean, everyone has their own opinions, but in my opinion, for most people, the number one cuss word among tutors is the phrase tips and tricks. It drives us crazy. Fingernails on a chalkboard, because tips and tricks is like a crash diet to shed 2 more pounds before prom or something. That can help you a little bit, but not really. Because if you learn how to get faster via some tips, that will let you get faster. But if you still don't know the rules, so 80% is content, in my opinion. 80% content, 20% strategy, where strategy is mostly about being meticulous and getting faster and time management and that kind of stuff. But in the end, if you don't know the content, there are limits to how far you can get. And I always tell kids, commas, rectangles, reps is really about just learning the bread and butter, the stuff that supposedly you're learning in school. And it's really just putting that work in. Now, one thing that's important to note, I'm not too proud to admit that I was wrong. I've been wrong on a lot of things. When we first chatted our very first Choose FI episode many years ago, I told you famously that you always tease me about, that we are in the least scalable industry on earth, which it's still a tough one because it's a very people intensive business. It's not widgets and everybody's different. So we have grown from 2 of us, my wife and I still teach all the group classes, to 14 of us, largely ironically on the backs of the test optional, the word test optional. When the word test optional came out 4 years ago, my mom was freaking out. She's kind of old. And so she sent me literal newspaper clippings in the US mail with, yes, mom, I'm aware of this test optional stuff. And so she's like, and I told her, mom, I said, listen, I was in the corporate world for a decade. I understand corporate doublespeak. When I hear it, it's not real. But if I'm wrong, I'm very entrepreneurial. I have 100 other ideas I will pursue. It's going to be fine. And the irony is, for the first 12 years, it was just my wife and I. And it's so not optional that we had no choice but to grow from 2 to 14 because it's just exploded. And because it is not just getting in, it is also merit aid. It's also other rules. So I'll give you an example. Is the University of Alabama test optional, at least for this year? Next year, we'll see. But not if you want merit aid. Like the Auburn merit aid grid requires scores. So there are places where you can get in possibly without scores. Oh, but not if you're homeschooled. Or at Elon, I'm tutoring a girl literally in an hour from now who wants to go to Elon University. She had never even taken a practice test. She's a senior. She's a panicked senior. She went to Elon on a tour during this Columbus Day break here. So she basically found out during the tour. One mom said, "So you're test optional, right?" And they're like, "Well, yeah. I mean, in general. I mean, not if you're homeschooled or if you want the direct admit business or direct admit nursing." She wants to do nursing, and so
Oh, wow.
now there's all kinds of little penalty boxes. Or if you don't submit scores, there's a placement exam. And if you don't do well in the placement exam, then you have to take these remedial classes that don't count for graduation, which could, this is Choose FI, delay graduation and therefore increase cost. So to me, I'm pretty mellow. I'm pretty hard to ruffle my feathers, but transparency and honesty is not too much to ask. Like, people don't realize there's all these trap doors. And truly, if things were truly super optional, I would already be doing any number of other pursuits. But we're busier than ever, and I'm tired. I need a nap. So it's important because parents are going to hear this from their friends, or kids will seek the path of least resistance and say, "I'm just going to chill." Well, no, you're not, because if you want Alabama, like, yeah, you can get into Alabama test optional, but I can't afford that price tag. And so parents will have to have this come armed with the knowledge of what I just shared right here, knowing that there are lots of different definitions to the word optional. Heavy on the air quotes.
Yeah, and like I said, on the info session that I attended, you spent a lot of time on this test optional nonsense that you basically debunked it. Could you go into this a little further? Because I think there are a lot of people out there who have read this repeatedly. Oh, this school went test optional. I know you just said clearly that for most schools, okay, whether that's true or not, it's still not going to either get you into a particular program or get you merit aid. But let's even just take that step back and say, like, are tests actually optional? Like, is that way overblown?
It totally depends. And it's hard because kids who are in high school who might be book smart are not, it's hard to understand that nuance and the context and a little bit of naivete that you can't expect a 16-year-old to have. So if a school was test optional prior to COVID, then they probably mean it. And in general, like Reed College, they're a very good liberal arts college. They were test optional before either you or I were even born. Like they mean it. Their shoes optional, test optional. They're a little hacky sack, et cetera. Like that is who they are. They've always been that way. And the University of California went test blind, famously with the whole lawsuit that happened due to the disability, all that stuff. So if your state touches, this is a crass rule, but if your state touches the Pacific Ocean, are they probably 100% on the up and up when they say test optional? Actually, yes. Like at Pepperdine University, only 22% of kids that applied last year, they're test optional. Only 22% even sent scores.
Wow.
So yeah.
Okay.
But on the other hand, Auburn, who last year was air quotes test optional, only admitted 6% of their entire student body without scores. And those who submitted scores got in 800% as often as those who didn't. So, and it's annoying, frankly. It takes you a long time to research. I actually just got picked since we last chatted at the parent info session. I'm speaking at a national conference. Apparently, I've been branded as someone who collects a lot of fun tests, optional data. So I get to speak at a conference here in January. So that'll be fun.
Nice. Okay. So, right, what I'm hearing is there are some schools that are truly test optional. Many of them have been that way for a very long time. But for people who are not locked in very precisely on Reed College or
schools that did so more recently, mostly due to COVID,
yeah,
may or may not mean it as much as those who
right.
those who have been doing it for decades. And that's legit. If you've been doing it for decades, you believe it, you live it, you've lived that path for a long time. So, and also there's context. I am promised a jersey from a person who will hopefully be drafted, who's playing at a certain very fancy school for football. And yeah, I mean, he could have gotten in no matter what he did because the coach's email, he's like, we're good. Just like, please don't make any national
Sure.
media stories and embarrass me. And so there's always
Right.
going to be exceptions.
Yeah, there are always edge cases. But how I'm reading this is it is a very dicey proposition for you as either a student or a parent of a student to say, oh, tests are optional now. My kid shouldn't even think about the SAT or ACT.
Now, their strategy, if you study, and get to a certain point, you might strategically submit to certain ones and not to others, but to not even try, to me, is wild. Just because you're, if not getting in, money on the table, other things, is foreclosing a lot of doors. And the one last thing, I mean, we can talk about FAFSA and CSS profile, is we are hearing from some of our students who texted me grateful that they took it because some of their friends didn't, because now that they're in college, they're applying for internships and there's a field in the internship form like, hey, what were your scores?
Huh.
Imagine if you're a student who didn't even sit for the test, much less try or study or to do well. Like the long tail of possible uses of it for grad school, for internship applications. I mean, merit aid is the big 800-pound gorilla for a lot of people in getting in, but there's a long tail beyond that sometimes as well.
Yeah. All right. So I think that was a wonderful overview of that side of things. But like we talked about a couple of times or alluded to here, we have these governmental forms. And I know things are changing with the FAFSA. And frankly, a lot of people, myself most certainly included, have little to no knowledge of the CSS profile, what it means, what it is, how, with the intersection of FAFSA. So let's start from the top here, Brian. Just give like your elevator pitch for what do we need to understand, think about with these governmental forms?
Sure. So, one thing I'm going to start off with, there have been some scary numbers we've been sharing so far. Things have been getting better with transparency of merit aid grids and so forth. There's also, alongside you filling out your FAFSA, since the same numbers you're using for a lot of that are the same numbers, to their credit, a lot of colleges have these things called NPC, net price calculator, and it's not going to, you can't hold them to it. It's not a guarantee, but in my experience, they're pretty darn accurate. And so if families think there's no hope, I'm not going to be able to afford college, the same data you're feeding into FAFSA and these other forms, if you entered in there, you might be pleasantly surprised. Like, oh, based on X, Y, and Z, we might qualify for some good aid. So that is well worth the time you spend just to know the good news, bad news about various schools and what the cost might be. Because just like there are stores that have a sticker price of this and they're known for being, Macy's is famous for charging, no one's paying that much for a pair of khakis. And oh, what do you know, 30% off. There's a lot of schools that do give various aid and can give you a very different sticker price. But the two main vehicles for the financial aid forms, there's the FAFSA, which is the feds, it's the federal application. And then there's the CSS profile, which is actually administered and owned by the College Board, the same people who do the AP exams and the SAT. So the FAFSA is more common at public schools and just more common in general. And the CSS profile is only used by about 150 schools out of the 2,000 or so in America. It is mostly private schools. It is mostly some of the more elite, fancy, harder to get into schools. But that's the high level look at it. Now, as far as filling them out, the FAFSA, you can think of it as sort of the 1040 EZ form, whereas the CSS profile is more like the 1040 long form. There's a lot more to it. And that was a true analogy I've used before, even before the new FAFSA, which neatly is now going to be far fewer questions than it used to be. So it's nicer from a customer and family perspective. Now, one important note, there are some people that are fashionably pessimistic that assume I'm well off enough that I'm not going to qualify for any financial aid. There are some places that, for whatever reason, it's their right to do it, they will not allow you to possibly apply for merit aid unless you fill out the FAFSA. So even if you make a gajillion dollars, just beware that a lot of colleges will still make you fill it out just because that's their rule and that's their right to demand, and it is what it is. But some people find that out too late and they are like, oh, oops. And so that is important that families fill it out. Worst case, you wasted a little bit of your time. But yes, it's better to have it and not need it than the other way around.
Gotcha. So, okay, that makes sense, Brian. When do people need to start thinking about filling in the form? Is there like a certain time range? Is it right before you apply? Like, talk us through that. And roughly how long does it take to fill this thing out?
Sure. Now, in a normal year, people would already be able to fill this thing out. It's been delayed a little bit. The current plan is that they are going to release it due to it because it is an overhaul. To be fair, please pardon the dust, our construction, but it's been delayed. The plan currently, again, we're recording in October, is to open it up in December of 2023. The deadline to submit is going to vary by institution, so you want to check, especially if your kid is applying or either early action or early decision. That's just an important note. But just at a high level, this upcoming change is the biggest change in the U.S. Department of Education's process for financial aid in the last 40 years. People had long complained that it's too difficult to complete the application, it's lengthy, it's confusing, et cetera. So think of like the federal Paperwork Reduction Act. They're trying to do better and be less onerous for the citizens that are the ones paying their bills. And so the goal really was to reduce the number of questions and make it more plain language and easier to fill out. Now, it is important every year, ideally, file your taxes at a decent time. So I'm a hypocrite. We've extended a time or two, but the sooner you can have during the years where you're going to have kids in college and filling out the FAFSA, if you can do a better job filling your taxes earlier, you can start finding out numbers earlier. Obviously, we're here on the 13th. I think the 15th is even the extension deadline. Yep. So almost everyone, by the time this episode comes out, will have their 2022 tax returns, I would imagine. So you're fine. But earlier is always better. Now, one thing that is great and is new is that under the new FAFSA, they're calling it the brand name. They're branding it as Better FAFSA. So, New Coke, but hopefully not New Coke, but Better FAFSA. You can directly import your tax info from the IRS to FAFSA. Now, that's going to require you to fill out a form. I don't know whether it's going to look like a DocuSign or otherwise, but it's going to be a thing where you consent to what they call DDX, like direct data exchange. And so that just lets the IRS talk to the Department of Education and share the variables on your tax return that are used to calculate where you stand from a financial aid standpoint. That's part of how they were able to make it shorter, is by allowing that importing of some of the data that you've already given elsewhere. So why make you reinvent the wheel? And another thing, because a lot of the people who listen to this, maybe you have an older child and now you have a younger child who's doing it. You may have heard of a term called EFC, which stands for Expected Family Contribution. It is now being called SAI, Student Aid Index. So Student Aid Index, it's similar. It's basically the new version of that number. So that is just so parents can say, where'd my EFC go? Don't be confused. Now, what is important is also that the majority, I was looking through a draft, they're still working through it, but a draft of what this one blog post, what it's going to look like. The majority of the items for the 2024-2025 FAFSA can be found directly on the actual income tax return, mostly on the first page or two. So if people don't, unless they have insanely complex tax situations, it's going to be, for once, that people always complain on the government. It seems like it's fingers crossed, it's going to be a pretty neat thing. Now, I don't know why they're doing this, but there are some people who, if they are on the lower income band, technically based on the way that it's calculated, some people will have an SAI student aid index that is actually negative, which means your family is not only not expected to contribute something, but it goes even further, which I don't know how that's going to manifest itself. Like you can't get less than zero, but that is something that it will certainly confuse parents, at least for the first year. But that just means that your estimated family contribution is going to be none or less than zero.
Brian, obviously, we're talking to the financial independence community here. I'm curious, you mentioned so the FAFSA, most of it, this new version, can come from, like you said, maybe page one of the income tax return. What is the intersection of your assets? How does that get included? How does that get included into the calculation?
Sure. So, before the FAFSA simplification, you were calculated the old version. Your EFC incorporated income, assets, also family size. How many kids do you have in college at the same time? And so, the lower the EFC, the more aid you'd potentially be eligible for. After the new FAFSA, the new simplification, as we mentioned, the EFC is being replaced by the SAI. And same thing, the lower the SAI, the more aid you can possibly be eligible for. The difference is the new formula increases, and they haven't finalized all the details. But as a general rule, the new formula is going to increase the income protection allowance. So it allows more of a student or a family's income to be excluded from that aid calculation. Some of the examples I was looking at last week with a student, because their family was looking at things, that in this case, the blog post, a parent income protection for a family of four for the old year, 32,600, and the new one is closer to 35.8, which doesn't look like that much, but it is 10%. And inflation, hopefully, is not 10% per year. So it's a little larger, which is not a bad thing. Now, what is also important is some parents look at this number and don't understand just because you have need does not mean the school is going to meet that need. And this is a highly, highly misunderstood topic in the college realm. So there's this thing called gapping, which is not very polite, but it happens. Not every school somebody's got to pay the bills. You got to keep the lights on. And so gapping is you can have a SAI that shows, no, I really do have this much need. The school might give you just a little bit and then leave you with a giant gap, which makes realistically it not affordable for you to attend that school. There are other schools, and if a family wants to do some research, it's pretty easy if you Google meets need schools, like a list of schools that promise that we accept our class, whoever gets in, like we promise to meet the need. So if the calculation says this, we'll find out a way to make that gap work. Obviously the schools that have larger endowments are better able to do that. Other places wish they could, but realistically, they just can't.
Right. That makes sense. And now, so right, Brian, the different components that make up the aid that's offered by the school. So I remember from back in the day, there's grants, which are best case scenario. There's loans, work study. I suspect there's some other options. Can you talk us through like what can people even consider when they're talking about, all right, this school has met my need, but is it actually as good as it looks?
So, I guess that's in the eye of the beholder as far as it good as it looks. In the end, there's a certain cost of attendance. There's tuition, room, board, books, other expenses. And to be fair, a lot of colleges are way better than they used to be at having a nice document on their website. If you type in COA, like if you type in University of Illinois, COA is like any school, you're going to find a pretty decent listing of it. Now, one thing that is important, because I mentioned how the FAFSA, how it used to be EFC, not SAI, but the genesis largely of part of why this episode is happening today is parents are hearing inklings of, wait a second, they're changing what? The biggest change in the better FAFSA is the elimination of the multiple sibling discount. So before, if you had two or more kids in college at the same time, the SAI, the student aid index, is no longer just simply divided between them. So the net impact is that aid packages may be reduced. You still list all your siblings, but before, if you had a hypothetical family where they just pop, they had all their kids just 1 year apart,
Yeah.
versus you had a family where they had kids every 4.5 years, there'd be a much more dramatic financial impact when you have your kids spread out versus together, and that is no longer going to be the case. So, in this next statistic might be one that applies to a lot of Choose FI listeners. There's an awesome article I'll share with you for the show notes from NerdWallet. Basically, it talks about how for families who have incomes between $75,000 and $200,000 as a household, that impact of removing the sibling discount, if there are going to be multiple kids at the same time and they're used to the prior calculations, could be a difference of thousands of dollars in the calculations. So that is an important a heads up for those families in that bracket. Now, even though the FAFSA calculation is not doing that, that does not prohibit colleges from still using that data in calculating any institutional aid, any grant that the school chooses to give you. So there's what the feds say. the school can always give you any money they want for any reason they want. So some schools that can afford so may not, just take the new number from FAFSA at face value. Many will, obviously.
Right, right, right. Those schools, will they see that that family has two, three, four kids in college at the same time and understanding that the form has
And
changed?
that's important. Yeah. So to be clear, just because the feds did that change does not mean you should not still list the multiple siblings when you fill out all of the forms, especially if they're both in college and you're filling out the form twice anyways for each kid. And the biggest change is truly the multiple sibling discount. There are also some changes that have been happening where is beyond the scope of the podcast. But if you have a divorce or separated parents, there's some changes based on who provides XYZ financial support, not necessarily based on the custody percentages or anything. So that's important to look at that fine print if that applies to you. Now, there is one piece of good news and one piece of cautionary news that is also useful to know about. The good news is, so grandparent 529 plans. So currently, if there's a grandparent that owns a 529 plan on behalf of a dependent, the distributions the student gets from that plan are counted as untaxed income, which means not that year, but the next year, because they do a look back of the prior year, it could impact their financial aid eligibility. But under the new plan, starting with the 24-25 year, those will no longer count as untaxed income for the student.
Okay.
And additionally, and again, caveat, this could still happen when they, in the final rules, they tweak it and change this. So double check. But the other good news is the value of the plan that's owned by a grandparent does not necessarily have to be reported as an investment in the FAFSA. Whereas if it is parent owned, then it is reported as a parent investment in the FAFSA. So that changes the ultimate calculation. So that is a small loophole. There's not a ton of loopholes in this process, but that is a small one where if you can coordinate with the grandparents as you're establishing 529s and things, that is important. Now, to be clear, FAFSA is the 1040 EZ. So on CSS profile, the grandparent 529, that trick will not really matter much because it is still taken into consideration for financial aid calculations for the CSS profile ones.
Okay, gotcha. So right, it's funny because you preempted my very next question, which was we led with the key is preparation and knowledge, and I think that's what those of us in the FI community like to think years ahead of time. So, are there any hacks for people in the FI community for financial aid? Again, with understanding that there are largely, we're talking about people with assets, and potentially some of them might have reached a point of financial independence, might not be working in the same capacity that they were previously. So again, just things to think about. So it sounds like this grandparent 529, I don't know if this is a loophole that will exist years down the road. This could always be closed. It could always be added to the FAFSA, obviously. But again, like you said, if you can coordinate it, it doesn't sound like there's any downside. It sounds like to go back to poker, right? It's a free roll situation where there's no downside to it potentially if you can coordinate it. So that's something to at least think about depending on your life situation. Are there anything else jump to mind of like, hey, if you could plan this years in advance in terms of your assets, your income, are there things to consider if somebody really wanted to optimize this? We're talking edge cases here, obviously, Brian, but anything to consider?
Yeah, I mean, I think if someone has some time to spare, two things. One thing is very clear. The more complex your family situation is, the less you should rely on some quick CNBC article that's just one or two screen lengths to provide you good advice on this, because college is, other than your house, one of the largest expenses that you might undertake in your lifetime. So if there's weird alimony and child support situations, if there's people who are self-employed, who own businesses, all the rules for how business valuation is counted and how money inside the business is counted, self-employed folks, farmers, like there's a lot of technicalities where if that happens to you, that's important that you spend more time than the average Joe researching this stuff. But also, people who are fire folks are some of those people where you might have an unorthodox situation where you look kind of weird, where you have a bunch of assets squirreled away, your FI, and you are not working as much and just living, so if you are in the disbursement phase, it would behoove you to start using the net price calculators earlier, just because I have no clue how that would look if you have tons of assets and then lower income. You might get some different results. But what is not good is there are people that I stay very far away from, scares me to death, who claim they have this magic potion that, we will find a way to totally legally make you artificially look poor in the eyes of FAFSA. I'm sure there's ways that can be optimized, but some of our clients who have done that have ended up being pitched some very gray area, variable life insurance, whole life insurance schemes, lockup period of this and blah, blah. I would not encourage people to indulge those folks if they are ever pitched those. It's very common with a lot of upper middle class parents. They somehow get a hold of those mailing lists and advertise that type of stuff.
Yeah, don't fall prey to any of that. That is great advice. So the net price calculator, that was something I wanted to follow up with you about. So I'm glad you brought it back up. Are those on the individual college websites? Is that where they exist?
Yeah, if you just type in and insert university name and net price calculator or NPC, it'll pop up pretty easily. And they've gotten way more accurate. When they first started, there was some bumpiness. I've had a lot of parents complain to me just in general, but that's the one part where they've been decently gratified. Like, yeah, they told us it was going to be X and it was off by $500, and it's good for being able to do financial planning.
That's cool. So, similar question about the FAFSA. So, let's say there's somebody out there listening, they have a kid in seventh or eighth grade, and the new FAFSA form comes out whenever it's finalized, and they wanted to, in a perfect world, go in and enter their information just to see what their SAI would be. Is that something you can do just for giggles, in essence, or do you have
Yeah.
to have a student at a certain age?
No, I mean you can do it. I mean, knowing that in 5 years from now your job situation might change,
Of course.
the stock market may have done various things. But yeah, just for funsies, you can do it. You just want to make sure don't go on about.com where they have some like outdated stuff from the GeoCities type era. You just want to go straight to an individual school's website so you get some fresh stuff.
Okay, that's great advice.
Now, there was one thing I wanted to mention because I do this whenever I talk to parent groups is it can seem if there's a student who is hardworking, maybe their GPA is not going to be the most amazing thing in the world, or their test scores, they're not the type of person who, even if they work really hard, might get to where they want on the merit aid front. Still try, get good grades, get good test scores, at least try. But I am always a big fan of parents knowing about other ways that are not academically related where you can save a boatload of money. So the first one, which I talked about back on one of the old Choose a 5 episodes, is being a resident advisor, because room and board is no joke. Like even if you get some good tuition, room and board is expensive. And so for 5 of my semesters, I did not pay room or board. And that was and they just forgot to charge me. So it's just boom, done. Like, that was great savings. But that requires pre-planning because they are very competitive positions. So you need to become a known in a good way, known entity to the Office of Residential Life. And, you have to know whether your kid is the type of person that would be a good, dorm dad, dorm mom,
Sure.
so to speak. And then there's one other example that I love so much. So we all know Boston is not cheap, and it also has a million colleges. I ran into one of our students here over winter break a year or two ago. We'd caught up. I was getting my battery replaced at the Apple store, and so I had some time to kill. We caught up. He's such an entrepreneur. He's such a hustler where you only get housing at his university for freshman year. And you can imagine what apartments cost in Boston. Yes. And so he went to his college and found a list of professors that were going to be going on sabbatical. And he got a
Oh,
list.
wow.
He said, hey, do you want to not pay to board your cat for a semester or water your plants or your lawn, whatever? And so he just got free rent. And so he had, a reference letter from his youth pastor or something but once he did a good job of it, he just literally hopped and he house sat for I think one semester he just came up no dice, but the other semesters, that's a lot of savings anywhere,
That's
but
amazing.
especially in Boston. So don't despair if you think, oh, I don't have a 4.0, so therefore I'm toast. If you put even just a little bit of Googling and creativity in it, you can really cut the cost of college no matter what your specific situation is. Even if that includes just graduating early because you brought in a boatload of AP credits by doing well on those exams. So there's
Right.
a million different avenues you can do.
Yeah, that's a brilliant one. And that very last one, I know we've had the millionaire educator on a number of times talking about different ways, AP exams, CLEP tests, and the like. We'll put those links in the show notes for sure. That's something I'll need to get him back on as well, because yeah, anything we can do to prepare in advance is just, like we said repeatedly here, just having this knowledge, thinking in advance, and just understanding there are many options. Like you said, life is not over if your grades weren't perfect from the time you were a freshman. There are different ways to think about this. And certainly the increase of the scores, that sounds like a very plausible option for a lot of people on tests that really you can study, you can improve, and you can really make a massive difference in your bottom line. So, Brian, as always, my friend, it is wonderful to see you. Thank you so very much for all this information. It's great. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions. So I'll maybe we'll do a follow-up, a Q&A. But if people want to find you, what is the best way to get in touch?
Sure. It's just edisonprep.com, or you can search Edison Prep on Facebook. The parent info session that you attended, we do those 6 or 7 times a year. The next one's November 14th, but I can give you links for the show notes for the info sessions. And like I said, it's important to us that we have the mock tests, the diagnostic tests that are for free on the weekends. So if parents just want to see good news, bad news, where their kid stands, we have those as a public service, just like the info sessions. And I can give you that link as well. So yeah, just Edison Prep, like Thomas Edison, edisonprep.com.
Wonderful. Brian, thank you again. Really appreciate it. And until next time.
Always happy to help.